I, for one, wasn't expecting such a scandalous expose of Mr. Dressup. The time he got drunk on air and challenged Big Bird to a boxing match. That time he sold Finnegan to pay his bookie.
Yeah, that was bad when he raced Finnegan.
He what?
He raced him. He put up in a dog race.
He had to make Finnegan race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he let him be used by a breeder.
No.
He bred Finnegan.
Oh no. Finnegan, there's a little known fact that Finnegan came from a puppy mill, so it was really brutal.
He didn't come from it, but he fathered a lot of the puppies, that one.
This is scandalous.
Yeah.
Truly scandalous.
Yeah.
And then there was the scandal of all those performance enhancing drugs he was feeding Finnegan so he'd win the races. Anyway.
Yeah.
But besides that, you didn't have too much dirt about him.
And Casey.
Okay, let's not talk about Casey. That's not even started. He had those really red cheeks.
He was making Casey eat too much soup. So, welcome to Sweater Weather.
Paris, this is my job. So, Paris is a puppet that Naomi. Paris, who are you?
Well, my name's Paris Woolbody. I'm a walrus, and I'm made of wool. But that's not why my last name is Woolbody. It's just a coincidence.
Okay.
And my body's actually made of repurposed sweaters. And I'm from a company called Kate and Levi.
Okay, but we're not doing advertisements for puppet companies.
Well, Naomi and I met in the Byward Market about 15 years ago.
Okay. Oh, gee.
And I was for sale.
Interesting. Naomi was a full-grown adult at the time.
Oh, yeah, she sure was. She was about 32. And she actually had seen one of my brethren be purchased as a gift for a child.
Okay.
She was jealous that she wanted one.
Okay, well, that's lovely, Paris. I mean, I guess, do you want to comment here on Mr. Dressup, the legacy of Mr. Dressup?
Well, I do declare that I'm not sure if Naomi's aware of this, but her love of puppets and her immediate love for me and her finding of a voice for me and discovering my name and personality and all that. I don't know if it has anything to do with Mr. Dressup, but it might. I think she has a deep love of puppetry.
Right, and it might be related to Mr. Dressup.
It might be, and the fact that I have such a high voice, I don't know, it's a little suspicious.
That it could be like Casey.
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking?
I don't know, I just thought of it. I don't know.
You don't look like Casey. I mean, you have these two long white tusks.
I'm not human, I'm a walrus.
And you're a walrus.
Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I really appreciate Mr. Dressup, and I love it when adults are into stuff that you're told, oh, now you're grown up, you're not supposed to do that anymore. Well, screw that. That's what Naomi said, and she got me, and that's what Mr. Dressup said when he made Mr. Dressup. And Mr. Rogers, who was interviewed in the documentary, talked about how Mr. Dressup just never lost, Ernie Coombs is his real name, but he never lost touch with the child inside him.
That's it, the child inside.
He never forgot what it's like to be a child. He never completely stopped being one.
Ah, well, thank you so much.
And I think the same thing is true of you guys.
Okay.
And that's why I get along with you so well.
Oh, it's so nice. Thanks, Paris.
Hey, Aaron.
No.
How can I support your show?
Paris? Okay, well, one thing you could do is, I mean, if you're such a fan of the show that you want to get all of our episodes.
I want double the episodes.
You want double?
Yeah.
Okay, there is a way to get double the episodes, actually. It's if you join our Patreon at patreon.com/Canadian Sweater, you'll have access to all of our premium episodes. You have a new one every other week. That's 2 a month, as well as access to the backlog of premium episodes.
Holy moly! I'm in.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, tell all your friends, Paris.
Okay.
And
hey, Naomi, can I borrow your credit card?
It's a little counterproductive, really. But I like the spirit. I like, the gesture.
Look, I don't have money, okay? I'm a puppet.
That's a good point. But maybe there's some people out there with credit cards listening to the show that would like access to our premium episodes. So go to patreon.com. And also, if you like the show, you just, rate it, review it on whatever podcast app you want to. Tell your friends. That all helps get the word out. You do that too, Paulus. Okay, tell all your stuffy friends.
I will.
Okay, thanks. All right,
I'll turn it over to Naomi now.
Okay.
Naomi! It's your turn on the mic. Okay, bye.
Bye, Paulus. That was nice of Paulus to show up.
Yeah, well, he really wanted to put in his 2 cents about Mr. Dressup.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Sweater Weather. This is a podcast about Canadian arts and culture. I'm Aaron.
I'm Naomi.
Today, we're talking about the documentary Mr. Dressup, The Magic of Make-Believe. This is from 2023 from director Robert McCallum. And of course, this is about the legendary children's entertainer, Mr. Motherfucking Dressup. Now, there wasn't much dirt on Mr. Dressup. I mean, this is clearly inspired by the documentary that was quite a big hit from a couple of years before this about Mr. Rogers. And all the memes were, can you believe it, that Mr. Rogers wasn't a pervert?
Well,
he didn't do anything bad
about him. There's nothing.
Well, as far as we know. Now, that's, I don't doubt it. I just mean that's the narrative that this documentary in true CanCon fashion was like, hey, they did a thing in the United States and let's just do it in Canada now. And that's actually kind of the origin of Mr. Dressup too.
And let me just say that with Mr. Dressup and Mr. Rogers, it's not that people thought they were a pervert and are surprised that they're not. It's just that we've seen so many of our idols fall. And it would be so upsetting. It would be the absolute worst to find out something heinous about Mr. Dressup or Mr. Rogers. And so it was a feeling of relief.
Yes.
They're really as sweet as they seem.
That's
what we still believe.
Sweet.
Yeah,
this was
so sweet.
Totally they know what they're doing here. Going back. I mean, this is true use of nostalgia, returning to your childhood.
Oh, yeah.
And just reliving this. But anyway. Okay, now, Naomi, Paulus was talking about how maybe, Naomi, you've been influenced by Mr. Dressup in your love of puppeteering. It's a thing Naomi does privately. She doesn't...
I'm an amateur.
She hasn't taken it on the road yet.
Yeah, no.
Not yet.
No.
Well, maybe
I'm a hobbyist. In my personal time, I enjoy puppetry.
Now, what was your childhood with Mr. Dressup like?
Well, to be honest, I didn't watch that much Mr. Dressup.
Yeah,
because
you were a Mr. Rogers gal.
Yeah, because I was an American child.
She was an American child, everybody.
I grew up in Maryland.
Well, until young, you were pretty young when you came here. But
7, but as Mr. Dressup says in the show, it's for preschoolers. I was already really too old for Mr. Dressup.
Probably
by the time we moved here.
Yeah,
and
probably caught a little bit of it, right?
Yeah. Oh, I for sure saw it a bit, but I wasn't a Mr. Dressup
fan.
Yeah, and it wasn't part of my routine. At one point, Mr. Rogers was very much part of my routine,
Because he was on every day, I guess.
Yeah, and I remember my sister and I having debates about whether Mr. Rogers or Sesame Street was superior.
Yeah.
And I always advocated for Mr. Rogers and preferred to watch Mr. Rogers.
You like that model of children's entertainment more?
To my mind, as I remember it, Mr. Rogers was more mature.
None of this kid stuff. This is Big Yellow Bird. This Snuffleupa what?
I mean, I feel now, of course, looking back, I love Sesame Street as well, but for me, it was a bit frenetic, and I liked the kind of calm, sort of almost more serious pace. And I loved Mr. Rogers and his puppets. And I loved the trolley, there was a trolley.
Yeah, right. I didn't really watch Mr.
And in
Rogers.
fact, my first bicycle was named Trolley after the trolley on Mr. Rogers.
Okay.
And the trolley on Mr. Rogers would ride into the town of imagination.
Okay.
And I really kind of hoped, I think that if I named my bicycle Trolley, that maybe I could ride it into
ride it all the way into the land of imagination. Did it ever work?
Oh yeah.
You might say that we still live in the land of imagination around here. Okay, so you really weren't you didn't really grow up with Mr. Dressup.
No, and then we moved to Canada when I was 7 in 1982. And I became aware of Mr. Dressup, but like only kind of vaguely aware. Like I definitely saw episodes and knew who Casey and Finnegan and Mr. Dressup were, but it was like a bit.
Yeah, it was too late to bond that tightly. Yeah,
and I was a bit too old for it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I did have a bit of a routine. Like I didn't watch. I don't remember loving Sesame Street. I actually, when it comes to Mr. Rogers, I was actively put off by Mr. Rogers. I still don't like his. I don't like that stare. The way he looks at the camera, I guess that's calming.
Yeah.
Can be a calming presence to many. I always found it off-putting. Even today when they were showing, because as we get into it, Mr. Dressup and Mr. Rogers they were very intimately linked. They knew each other, and they worked together. Mm-hmm. But even today when we're watching on the documentary, there are a few clips of Mr. Rogers' show, and he's gazing into, like, the way he's looking into the camera while he's playing the piano, and he's like not looking away from the camera the whole time, just playing the piano.
Yeah,
and like something like that just weirded me out a bit.
Okay.
I don't know. I never. And just his the way he talked, his voice, his yeah, people like that. I get it. I never liked it. I always preferred Mr. Dressup.
Okay.
Yeah, and as I said, I didn't like Sesame Street that much. I did have a bit of a routine with Mr. Dressup as far as I can remember. I remember, like, you know, my mom dropping me off at my grandparents' house. Like maybe this was the summertime or something, and I needed to be looked after or something. And I'd watch Mr. Dressup with my grandma, and she loved Mr. Dressup.
Okay,
she loved Casey and Finnegan. She loved Finnegan.
Oh my God,
Finnegan
cute.
was the cutest, and seeing Finnegan again.
He is the cutest.
He is a very cute puppet. Yeah. It's hilarious.
Can I just tell you one thing that I just remembered is, like, I really loved Polka Dot Door, and like that's Canadian too.
Oh yeah, Pokeroo. Yeah.
I was obsessed with Polka Dot Door.
Yeah.
And like I again like had this notion that like Polka Dot Door was like more mature for like older kids. I was really little.
Big green. What is he? Pokeroo? Is he supposed to? He's anything?
Doesn't show up that often.
He's like a green dragon sort of.
Yeah, he's a Pokeroo. There's only one of him. But I remember how, like, I'd always watch it at my grandparents' place in the summer. I don't think I really watched it otherwise for whatever reason. And it was always on at 6 p.m. But like they would have this segment on the Polka Dot Door where they would like teach you how to tell time. So they would like have the clock set at a certain time.
Yeah.
And then it'd be like, oh, let's see what time it is. And then I remember like very seriously explaining to my grandmother like why I liked Polka Dot Door. And I was like, well, you see, they always show you what time it is. And I really think that's important because then the viewer has an opportunity to know what time it is.
It's educational.
And then later I realized, like, it occurred to me like a few days after I said that the show's always on at 6. Like, it wasn't really the time that they said it was. And I'd given my grandmother this whole talk about how important it was to know what time it is.
And you never knew what time it was.
Well, no, like I just believed that it was like somehow 2:30, even though like it was clearly 6:10 or whatever.
That is, now you mention it, that's kind of confusing.
And then I felt really dumb because I had given my grandmother this whole talk, and like in my mind she must have been thinking the whole time like, oh, you're so dumb. But really, of course, she had no idea what I was talking about.
I'm sure your grandmother would be okay, like, oh, little Naomi.
I know, I was so embarrassed when I realized, like, it was one of those moments of like, oh my God, I really messed up.
Well,
you know what I mean.
I know what you mean. This documentary, oh my God, it pulls
at the old heartstrings.
It pulls at the old heartstrings.
I mean, yes, it's derivative of the Mr. Rogers documentary.
Obviously, the intention was, look, everybody loved the Mr. Rogers documentary. They loved finding out that he was pure as the driven snow.
Yeah.
And so we're going to make sure we're going to do that, tell that same story for Mr. Dressup. Yeah. And they did it, and by golly, it worked.
Yes.
It worked really well. So, I mean, you know, you should, if you've listened to the show, our show at all, you know that we do spoilers. We just tell the whole story. So you should probably go watch the documentary if it's something that you like.
Not that there's any big shockers coming.
There's no shockers or anything, but like, we're going to tell a story. So, this documentary opens with several of these, like, all these biggest Canadian, like, celebrities who grew up on Mr. Dressup and telling us their memories, like why they love Mr. Dressup. And this is like Michael J. Fox and Bruce McCullough and Peter Mansbridge and Eric McCormick. And
all these people who are like, I would never have been an actor if it weren't for Mr.
Yeah, and you
Dressup.
realize when the things they were saying, like, oh yeah, like Michael J. Fox was saying this, it's like how he might let Mr. Dressup would just put on a hat, and then his whole thing was like, I'm gonna pretend to be a different person now that I have a hat on, and that was Michael Fox. Michael J. Fox like says like that's like the first time he thought about acting.
Yeah, he's like,
He's
you
like,
could just put
wow.
on a hat and become another person.
Yeah, and that was such a big deal to him.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael J. Fox also mentions that like the thing about Mr. Dressup was that he was an adult but not really an adult, and that made him easier to relate to. And Eric McCormick from Will and Grace, he mentioned that he named his son Finnegan.
Yeah, after the dog.
It seems like he was named after the dog. And we know a dog, our neighbor's dog, is named Finnegan.
Shout out to Finnegan.
Shout out to Finnegan, Finny, as they call him, named after.
I wonder if he's named after Finnegan.
I mean, of course.
He must be.
It's got to be.
We'll have to confirm
to ask later, but. So we find out that Mr. Dressup ran from 1967 to 1996. So 29 years for 4,000 episodes.
That's amazing.
4,000 episodes exactly. And it's really fun. So after we get through like the opening statements from all these celebs, Canadian celebs who love Mr. Dressup, and I should say like one of the best ones actually is Jonathan Torrens.
Mm-hmm.
They go to him quite a bit, and he has clearly like is really loved Mr. Dressup. He's like emotional talking about. A lot of these guys get emotional talking about Mr. Dressup. It really is kind of amazing. They use Casey and Finnegan, the real original Casey and Finnegan, as a framing device, kind of like to open up the story of Mr. Dressup. So the puppeteer, Judith Lawrence, who created and operated Casey and Finnegan for many years, it participates in the documentary. Mm-hmm. She's interviewed quite a bit, and she does do Casey and Finnegan a little bit for the camera too.
It was interesting to learn that she was Australian, because I do remember wondering like why Casey had like a bit of an accent of some kind.
Right, yeah, Casey, I mean, they make a lot of the fact that Casey was non-gendered.
Yeah.
Like it was non-binary.
You can't tell if Casey's a boy or girl.
We didn't know. We didn't know.
You're not supposed to be able
and that
to.
was intentionally. They wanted any kid to identify with Casey.
Yeah, which is great.
Yeah, so that was kind of interesting. But you thought that Casey had, I just remember the very high voice.
Yeah.
I didn't remember an Australian. Yeah, but anyway, Judith Lawrence, she's Australian. She has an Australian accent.
No, I definitely remember being like, Casey talks a little bit differently, like doesn't have a Canadian accent exactly. So yeah, it was interesting. Now I understand why.
The documentary also has in the introduction like a little bit of an address that Mr. Dressup made, or Ernie Coombs made to a graduating class at Trent University. Must have been sometime in the 90s or something. And do you remember what he said?
No.
Like it was just like, well, what kind of advice do you have to give when you've spent your whole life making crafts out of toilet paper rolls? Things like that. And he was just saying like, try to have fun. keep your crayons sharp.
Yeah, he's like, keep your crayons sharp. Always put your caps on your markers. Keep your sticky tape untangled.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, very practical advice.
Yeah. I like keep your crayons sharp.
Yeah, and right away, like opening that way, you're like, oh man, this guy is so dang sweet.
Yeah.
And you're already got the old heartstrings. You feel them thrumming a little bit. You're oh man. So we find out that Ernie Coombs, was actually not a Canadian at all. He was born, of course, he was born in 1927 in Maine. He served in World War II, and he tried to be a professional artist after that. But so that's what he learned how to do. He went to art school, I guess, and learned how to draw. He was very good at drawing. If you remember on the show, he would draw right on camera. He was so cool with he'd always do. I remember really liking that. There was a lot of like Bob Ross energy to Mr. Dressup too, where he would just be like describing what he's drawing. Like, we're going to put the shoes on the clown now. And like,
and they were really good drawings.
And they were quite good drawings. So he had a background as a professional artist. He went into set design for theater and then began working in children's theater, and then he started performing. And so as he's traveling around looking for work in theater, he ends up in Pittsburgh and he begins to work on Fred Rogers' show, Mr. Rogers. So it's not the Mr. Rogers show yet, but he's doing a kid's show.
It was called like the Children's Corner. Or
yeah, I think maybe it was on radio at the time still, or maybe it was early TV. Anyway, Fred Rogers was a great friend, and Ernie Coombs was a puppeteer for Fred Rogers, and so.
And then they came to Canada together.
Yeah. So Mr. Dressup, I'm gonna call him Coombs or Mr. Dressup. Anyway, Coombs, like, he met his wife Lynn while in Pittsburgh, and then Fred Rogers was his best man. At his wedding.
Mr. Rogers was Mr. Dressup's
Can you believe this? What the heck? You're like, these two guys were friends?
Yeah.
Incredible. So actually, Mr. Dressup got his start in Canadian television via Mr. Rogers, because Mr. Rogers, this was really interesting. The CBC, because this is the early 60s, it's 1962, I believe. The CBC had a big budget for for children's programming that Mr. Rogers couldn't get where he was in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
So they lured Mr. Rogers to Canada to start a children's show. And that's where the Mr. Rogers show, it was called what was it called? It was called just Mr. Rogers?
Was it?
What was the show called?
Was that one called The Children's Corner?
I don't know. I think the first one he did was called The Children's Corner in Pittsburgh.
Was it actually called Mr. Rogers? I'm not sure on CBC.
Anyway,
Mr. Dressup or Ernie Coombs worked for him.
Worked for him in Canada. So he came to Canada with Mr. Rogers, and Mr. Rogers did a season of the show and then wanted to go back to the United States, and so he did. And that left a gap in the CBC children's programming that and Mr. Rogers said, well, why don't you give Ernie a shot? And so Ernie started his own show in the old slot that Mr. Rogers had.
But first it was a show called, was that Butternut Square? Yeah,
that was the one. So Ernie Coombs, at first he has a show called Butternut Square, and it starts in 1964.
And there were tons of different characters. He was just one of them.
But it was his show. He was still, I don't know. I mean, I couldn't really, this is way, way, way before my time, obviously. Yeah. So I have no idea. I had no experience of Butternut Square. Cute name for a show, though.
Very cute.
I mean, I think the big thing was that that's where Casey and Finnegan began. Judith Lawrence began those.
She made them.
She made those characters for that initial show.
She made the puppets.
She made the puppets, invented the characters, and the show was doing well. But then after a couple of years, it was going to be canceled because the CBC needed the studio they were in, for a different show that was called This Hour Has 7 Days. And they show some footage from this old talk show, and you realize, This Hour Has 7 Days. So the long-running sketch comedy show, This Hour Has 22 Minutes.
Is a play on that. Yeah, I never knew that.
That show, never heard of.
No.
But the parody, I know.
Yeah.
That's really funny.
Yeah, I realized that too. That's really funny.
This Hour Has 22 Minutes is a future episode of Sweater Weather. So they were going to cancel Butternut Square altogether. And then a phone call.
The Mulroney government.
No.
Oh,
this is the 60s.
Oh,
Naomi.
okay, sorry.
No.
They cut something.
That's a lot later. So, and so Butternut Square was for the chopping block. It was gonna be roasted and squashed.
Turned into a soup.
Maybe it's made into soup. But then a phone call was made by the producer, and they're like, "Look, we'll use half of the studio. You only need half of the studio." For that, This Hour Has 7 Days. It's just a couple of desks and some chairs for guests. So we'll use just half the studio. And so they had to change. So they had to change the name of the show because it was no longer going to be a square. Because they only had half the space. And so the show became Mr. Dressup at that point. What I was not surprised to learn, but I had never thought about, was that the show was largely improvised.
Yeah.
They just had concepts okay, so we're gonna have a conversation about this, and then they would just kind of go with the flow. And
Judith the puppeteer was improvising
these
Casey
lines.
And Finnegan. Yeah.
Yeah, improvising jokes and stuff.
Yeah.
And think about that, operating two different puppets and improvising jokes at the same time.
Well, I have been known to do that. in our private life.
That's true, but not on camera.
Yeah. I've operated up to 3 puppets.
Obviously, it's possible for a real professional.
No, but yeah, she was really good and really witty, and like she and Mr. Dressup were really playing off each other, and they were saying how like they couldn't do multiple takes, like it was like
they had no budget.
Yeah, so they just like they had one chance to get the show right, and they improvised it. And
it was recorded live to tape, and they would have said they'd almost never stop taping. So they would just run the tape, and then they would go.
Yep.
Yep.
So like improvising and getting it right the first time.
Probably cutting some things out here and there or something, but I don't know. I mean, mostly getting it right.
Yeah.
You know, throughout the documentary, they're bringing in the talking heads, like people who were involved in children's programming at the CBC or producers, things like of that nature. But obviously, we love when we see a celebrity we recognize. And so I think I'm not sure which. I think maybe it's Bruce McCullough talking about how Mr. Dressup was just, I mean, everyone says he was just very like kind.
Yeah.
And so that was the energy you always got from him, was that he was a really nice guy, and he wasn't like other adults because he wasn't like mean or bossy or anything, and
he understood, like he wanted to play dress up. That was his whole thing.
Wanted to play dress up. It is funny, like the montages of like all of the different costumes that Mr. Dressup
yeah, and he has his tickle trunk with all the costumes in it.
Pulling out the tickle trunk, of course. But I guess there was like a lot of people seemed. I wonder if the celebrities who were being interviewed were prompted with to remember a particular sketch about when everyone's eating soup together.
Yeah,
I wonder if they were all prompted to remember that, or maybe they are all showing like, hey, do you remember this? And they showed them that segment. Because a bunch of the celebrities comment on Mr. Dressup, quite a funny, actually, it is pretty funny scene where he's trying to get Casey to eat his soup, his chicken noodle soup. Yeah. He's like, Casey, like, finish your soup. And Casey says, I don't want any more.
Casey's like, no, thank you very much.
And then Mr. Dressup says, but you said not long ago you really, really wanted some chicken noodle soup, and I went out of my way to go get you chicken noodle soup.
I went to the store and bought you some, and I made it for you.
And I made it for you, and I'm serving it to you now. And he's like, well, I don't want any more. It's like, but Casey, if you don't eat your chicken noodle soup now, like later on, you're going to get hungry again, and you're going to eat a bunch of junk food instead of this healthy chicken noodle soup. And Casey's like, uh-huh. And
then Casey's like, why are you yelling at me? And Mr. Dressup was like, well, I'm angry with you, Casey. They have a fight about it.
They have a fight about the soup. But he wasn't really yelling.
No, but he was like
getting stern.
Yeah, he was getting stern. He's like, that's not right, Casey.
Yeah, but then he had to apologize to Casey afterwards.
Yeah, he's like, well, I'm sorry I yelled, but I am mad at
you. Meanwhile, Finnegan, they probably cut to Finnegan, and he's looking worried. Opening his mouth and shaking his head like, no, don't fight, you two.
Yeah. But yeah, all the celebrities were saying how like it was kind of charming that Mr. Dressup, like he was authoritative. Like he was a parental figure towards Casey.
Yeah.
So he is kid-like, but he's also authoritative.
Yeah, that's kind of a fine line, and that's what that character was really. Like he's still obviously being an adult, but not an adult. That's what Michael J. Fox said.
Yeah.
It makes us like, yeah, you're right. Like that's what he's like. The other characters that on the show are Aunt Bird. And Alligator Al. I don't really have many memories of those guys, but they look pretty cute. It's kind of interesting. So, Ernie Coombs is the guy on camera all the time, but apparently he insisted that Lawrence, the puppeteer, got the same pay as him. So that was, and she said she didn't even know about that. They'd never talked about.
Yeah.
They never talked about salary or how much anybody made, but like Ernie Coombs privately insisted on that.
Yeah, because she was doing half the work, he said.
Yeah, obviously she was really, really important to the show. Yeah, so they talk about the tickle trunk here, and there were no skeletons in the tickle trunk. It was all just fun costumes.
Yeah.
What were some of the costumes you see? Like one that they show a few times is like I don't know, is it like a spider?
I think so.
Outfit?
It's like extra arms.
Because it's like black. It's like a black spandex leotard thing that has all these extra arms.
Yeah.
So you end up with, I don't know if you end up with 6 or 8 arms.
And there's like a bat and a cape. And
the cape. There's always some big hat.
Lots of hats.
A lot of clown stuff too.
Yeah,
He's
clown
kind of dressed
noses.
as a clown a few times.
But like, what's interesting to me is I remember like like moving to Canada and kids had certain expressions and stuff that I didn't know. And tickle trunk, like everyone referred to their dress up box
as a tickle trunk.
And I never knew why.
And that was Mr. Dressup
yeah,
specific.
he invented that. Yeah.
That's interesting. People still, I think kids still say that. Like you have a trunk full of stuff.
We had a dress up box in my house. It was just called the dress up box.
It was called the dress up box?
Yeah.
You had one of those?
Yeah, it was like my mom had put like old clothes from like the 70s and stuff.
And you were allowed to dress up in them?
Yeah, like we would sometimes just play dress up.
Oh, that's fun.
You never played dress up?
I did a little bit with my sister, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, every kid loves playing dress up.
Yeah, I don't know if I did that much though. I mean, I did it. My memory of that is there were old clothes. It was like there was some old clothing, maybe my sister's old clothing.
Yeah.
She's older than me. So when I was small, she made me dress up in her old clothing, and I would do it just to entertain her a little bit.
Oh, okay. Well, my mom, I guess, had put some of her clothes from like, I guess the 60s, really, like some kind of wild outfits in there.
So these were adults' clothing?
Yeah.
Okay. And so you're putting on these outfits that were too big for you and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And they'd be like kind of stuff that was like extremely out of fashion. That was kind of,
yeah,
crazy looking to us.
Yeah.
And then I think actually our grandmother's friends had like given us some old clothes. I don't know. We just had some sort of crazy old clothes in there.
Yeah.
And we would just kind of dress up, and I don't know why. And yeah, of course, like I do remember also like putting like women's clothes on our male cousin and thinking that was hilarious for some reason.
Yeah, I think that was entertaining to my sister.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember the clothes being very small, very, very tight, and she's like making me like squeeze into them, and then I'd prance around.
Yeah, girls love dressing boys up in like very feminine clothes for some reason.
Yeah.
Good times.
So they talk about his art, how he was able to draw so well, and it is kind of like ASMR, that sensory response thing where you're just like, you can just watch somebody do something like methodically and
oh yeah,
you're just like, oh, and you're just, for some reason that's entertaining, or
the drawing.
Yeah, it's like soothing.
Like watching
it's like soothing.
The drawing is sort of magically come into being.
Yeah. Bruce McCullough was saying, well, like you knew that he was going to draw like bacon and eggs or whatever, but you just sit there and wait for the eggs to appear.
Yeah.
There's one egg, there's another egg.
Yeah.
It's like, for some reason, that's just endlessly entertaining. And it was. So the bare naked ladies show up. They trot out different celebrities at different times, and so all the bare naked ladies are sitting on stools.
Yeah, in a row.
Yeah, in a row. But but like they were all, of course, praised for Mr. Dressup. They loved them, all that stuff. But at one point, they said, wow, it was really amazing that Mr. Dressup, he entertained everybody for so many years, and he never messed up. He was always what everyone expected of him. Mm. And that's a little bit poignant because one of the bare naked ladies, Stephen Page, they kicked him out of the group, right? Because he had issues with reliability, and he had like a substance abuse issue.
Oh, yeah.
You ever hear about that?
Yeah,
it was weird. They cut really close in when he said that, as if to like, that was something that the bare naked ladies were well aware of, how you can fail as an entertainer.
Okay.
Because they had to kick him out because bare naked ladies were a weird, like they're so, I mean, I guess they're still a band. They must still tour. Maybe they still make new music.
Mm-hmm.
They probably do, right?
I don't know.
But they're like squeaky clean, upbeat.
And I guess maybe that's the thing, right? That makes me think about how, like, at one point in the movie, one of Mr. Dressup's kids in real life is like, he was just the same person at home as he was on TV.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's the case with Mr. Rogers too. Like they were both just being themselves. And like people say over and over, yeah, he was just being himself. He was just being himself. And like, it's really dangerous when someone who has like a squeaky clean persona is not that person off stage, right? Because that's when we're so crushed and disappointed and shocked to find out, like with Bill Cosby or whatever, like,
right, yeah, like
it's a completely different person and this is just an act,
Yeah, if you were Andrew Dice Clay and you find out that, it's like not as surprising.
Yeah,
right.
But like when we're like, oh, this is like someone we all like thought of as like our dad or whatever, or our uncle, or like,
it's particularly bad.
it's really just somehow crushing. And in both the cases of Mr. Rogers and Mr. Dressup, you're like relieved and really heartwarmed to find out like, no, that's who they really were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean we're just vibing. You're just watching this and just vibing, being pulled back into memories you forgot you even had.
Yeah, you have a big smile on your face.
I mean, it's Casey and Finnegan, like watching these clips of Casey and Finnegan, you're just like, oh man, these two are back. Now, always found Casey annoying. I don't like the puppet. Like, I don't like the rosy red cheeks on a hard head. I always found Casey a little bit off-putting.
Yeah, I understand.
For that reason. But Finnegan.
What a dog.
What a dog. He opens his mouth and, like, shakes his head.
Yeah. And he, like, whispers and...
He whispers to Casey.
Yeah. And then Casey says, oh, Finnegan says blah, blah, blah. Which is so sweet.
Isn't that cute? They have a very close relationship.
Yeah.
Casey and Finnegan. They talk about how good Mr. Dressup was with arts and crafts. How he could make anything out of a toilet paper tube and beer caps. And he always made a point that it was extremely accessible. He always wanted it to be with the easiest to find items that any kid would have hanging around.
Yeah, they wanted anyone to be able to do the craft.
Yeah.
And
I didn't like doing crafts.
I wasn't a huge craft person.
Yeah,
I like to draw.
You like to draw? You like to draw?
Yeah,
I drew. Everyone likes to draw.
My sister and I had this like giant crayon carousel with like every color of Crayola.
Yeah, like how many would have been in there?
I mean, to me, it seemed like approximately 1,000, but I'm not
It was
sure.
probably, they do make those Crayola sets that are like 500 or something like that.
Yeah, it was the most you could get, I think. And it was in this like plastic round carousel where there was like a special holder for each crayon and you would keep them in orders.
Yeah.
And there's a sharpener.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so you could keep them sharp.
You can keep them sharp the way that Mr.
I remember
Dressup
getting
recommends.
that and as a gift from my parents, and it was like so amazing.
Yeah. Good. That was a score.
So I really liked drawing with those, I remember.
Yeah.
I was never a good visual artist. My sister is a professional visual artist, but I was not.
Yeah. You're more of a wordsmith.
I'm more of a word person. But I did enjoy some crafts, and I did enjoy those crayons. I was going to say I really liked... You didn't like crayons?
I don't like crafts. I hate doing crafts. I always hated it.
Really?
Yeah, I didn't like having to do it in school. I never liked the crafts.
Remember, now that I think about it, I really did love gluing things to other things. And I loved glitter, like glitter pens and stuff like that.
I think I was like an anxious little kid about some things because I remember just thinking that I couldn't do the crafts very well. And it really bothered me that like it wouldn't be perfect. Wouldn't be good enough. And so I was like that's why I didn't like crafts, because you would see
some kids can make the most incredible craft. And
but others don't do crafts very well, and they don't care, and it doesn't matter, nor should
me.
it.
I wasn't good at it, but I liked it anyway. Like it was the actual act of gluing and making, and
Yeah.
But I was gonna say I liked in the Bare Naked Ladies interview, one of them said that he was having a beer with Mr. Dressup.
Oh, yeah, they were on tour. Because Mr. Dressup goes on tour. That's what starts to happen a little bit later, but go ahead, yeah.
And then he was like about to throw out the bottle cap from his beers, from his beer bottles and the caps. And Mr. Dressup was like, no, don't throw those out. Those are good for crafts. Put them in his pocket. And then it cuts to him gluing bottle caps.
2 beer bottle caps to some cardboard to make something I couldn't recognize what it was.
Yeah.
Mr. Dressup at its peak had 500,000 viewers a day.
Wow.
And that's just in Canada.
That's amazing.
And Canada, there's a smaller population back then. So that's a lot of kids watching. Of course, there weren't that many stations on TV, so the public broadcaster is getting a huge audience. Oh, this is a funny anecdote. So, he has little kids at the time. And Mr. Ernie Coombs goes home and is hanging out with his kids, and so his kids would watch the show. They'd watch the show. They'd watch the other shows on CBC2. And so, The Friendly Giant. You may remember that as another kids show.
I never saw it, but I remember.
Yeah, I have very, very, very vague memories of the Friendly Giant. But So I guess he was home. It was like a day off and he was watching TV with his kids and they were watching The Friendly Giant and it ended. And I guess his son like turned to him and said, Dad, you've got to get to the studio. You're on next.
That's so sweet.
Isn't that the cutest story?
Yeah, that is the cutest story. Imagine having Mr. Dressup as your dad.
Yeah, so they were talking to the kids, and so he has a son and a daughter who, of course, they're speaking glowingly of their father on this. And the son says, well, like when I was really, really small, like sometimes kids would make fun of me because they would see that my dad like wore funny clothing on television, and they'd say, oh, your dad's a sissy or something like that. But that was, by the time they were a little bit older, that was long gone. And there's an interview with a granddaughter who remembers, her grandfather picking her up at school one day and all of the kids just going bonkers because they see Mr. Dressup in the car. And so like all the kids in the school bus are like leaning out of the windows and
like screaming.
And she's like, what?
But I mean, they show Jonathan Torrance saying like, I wonder what it was like for his kids to have to share their dad. Yeah. With like the whole country. And then the kids are just like, no, we had a great childhood. Like,
and they're like, no, we loved him.
It
was great. Yeah. So this is interesting. His wife seemed to be a very sweet person. Lynn is her name. So she opened a daycare. Makes sense. It was called the Butternut Center. Clearly inspired by the name of that first show. I wonder what the use of butternut. I mean, you must be thinking of it as like a garden. It's like a kindergarten. This is where we grow like gourds. Like butternut squash. That's very cute. So Ernie Coombs, he goes on tour to make extra money, and it becomes a really big thing for him, touring. So he went all over Canada. These were eventually these were professionally organized tours. Went to every corner of Canada, and actually a lot of the celebrities who were interviewed mentioned like they saw Mr. Dressup in person at a live show. And this was interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess this makes sense. I hadn't thought of it this way. Someone says that it made the kids, that when they see Mr. Dressup for real, it makes it feel like the fantasy world that Mr. Dressup comes from that is real as well. And so that was just like an amazing contact for a kid to experience.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So these shows were a really big part of his life, the touring show. And another funny anecdote, I guess the people he's touring with, some of the stagehands or whatever, they try to prank him. They try to prank Ernie Coombs, Mr. Dressup, by putting shaving cream inside one of his red clown noses that's inside the trunk, and because they know he's going to have to put it on at some point. And apparently, they're watching anxiously as Mr. Dressup's going through his tickle trunk and he's ready to put on the red nose. He sees the shaving cream in the nose, and they think, well, he still has to put it on because he's got to do the bit. But apparently, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out another clown's nose. He had an extra, and you're like, who has?
Not in his pocket, in the trunk.
It was in the trunk?
I don't know where it was.
Why are you ruining my story here? They didn't say where it came from.
No, actually they didn't.
It sounds like he pulled it out of his pocket.
Oh, that is a nicer story. He always has a clown nose in his pocket.
They're like, who has an extra clown nose?
With them at all times.
Mr. Dressup does. Mr. Dressup does. There's a little bit of so now's the time to compare Mr. Dressup to other kinds of kids programming like Sesame Street. So Sesame Street shows up a couple of years after Mr. Dressup, actually in 1969. It was like informed by very specific developmental goals, right? And it's fed by, I mean, the show doesn't say this, but Sesame Street's like, it's fed by like new psychological theories about early childhood development and stuff like that. Mr. Dressup was much less informed by that kind of thinking.
Right,
it was about like creating a fantasy world for kids where they felt safe. Yeah. And
you didn't learn like the alphabet or...
No, but like you did learn about performance and imagination.
Oh, sure.
And it is true. Like I remember...
Although he talks about like learning to tie your shoes and stuff.
He did do that, eh?
Yeah.
I do remember watching, because like when you look at these segments now, Mr. Dressup, you're like, God, it's so slow moving. Like everything is so fast paced in media now. Everything is a quick cut, everything.
Yeah.
And you're just, when you watch these segments, and I remember seeing like an old like going on YouTube and watching a segment or something and just being struck by how slow it is.
Yeah.
And I remember being a kid and just like kind of leaning into the television as he's putting on like a coat.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like maybe it's like a toy soldier style coat or something
Yeah.
with long tails. And then he puts on that. And I remember being like fascinated by how he was changing, like right in front of you. You're like, oh wow, he was that, and now he's becoming this. And so whatever it was, I remember it working. It really did work. I mean, and it makes sense that all of these performing artists identify with Mr. Dressup because he was a guy who, as Michael J. Fox said, like showed you could become something else.
Yeah.
So that was kind of interesting. In 1978, he won an ACTRA award for Best Children's Programming. And at that point, when you're thinking like the show's been on for 15 years already. So guys had a long career already, and I'm not even born yet.
Yeah.
So
that is amazing.
It is kind of amazing. So when the 80s roll around and there's a new federal government, Brian Mulrooney's conservative, there's some budget cuts to the CBC. And so a couple of other kids shows get cut. And they cut Mr. Dressup's budget as well. Now it's still going, but they don't have the same money they used to. They mentioned that, before some of these budget cuts, they had enough money that they'd go film on location. So they'd take they have these segments that I'd never seen because this is before my time, where like Casey and Finnegan are in a car wash. They're like riding in a car
with Mr. Dressup.
With Mr. Dressup and learning about the car wash, or they go to Marineland and they're like watching the whales. Or they're in the Arctic or something. Isn't there one and they're up north? They're ice fishing. Okay. Yeah. So they had a bit, like, I don't remember that at all. Mr. Dressup for me was
in the studio.
And that's it. So that was kind of surprising. The costume budget for Mr. Dressup was $25 per 2 episodes.
At first, yeah.
But the costume designer they were interviewing said, well, by the time I left, it was $35 per episode. So not much. We're into the mid 80s, and so like by the early 90s, the puppeteer Judith Lawrence, the one who plays Casey and Finnegan,
and Auntie Bird,
and Al the alligator, whatever. She wants to retire. I guess she's just kind of fed up, and she's kind of a funny person on camera too.
Yeah, she is.
She seems grumpy.
Yeah, she's like kind of terse.
She's terse and grumpy, and you're like, oh wow, she was Casey, eh? Like, that's kind of, she's a funny presence, but she like retired and she took her characters with her, and the CBC tried to argue with her that they had invented the characters or that
they owned them.
They own them.
Yeah, she's like, I literally built these puppets and invented these characters, and they're coming with me.
Yeah, so she wouldn't let anyone else do them, and so. And that was that. So that was that for Casey and Finnegan. And, in the early 90s then, Mr. Dressup had to totally change all of its characters. And I remember like flipping by it later. I know I'm already well past the time that I'm watching Mr. Dressup, but I'm seeing all these new puppets. I'm like, oh, who's this? Who's that? Oh, interesting. Not that I stayed to watch, but that was the era. It was they brought in many, many other puppeteers after that. This Judith Lawrence, they show footage of her doing a performance of Casey and Finnegan, like in a bar. Yeah. Just like a one-off.
Vancouver Island.
Yeah, like an evening in a bar with like Casey and Finnegan. And she's telling the story about how these people in the bar were like loving it so much that they started to cry. Yeah. And she was like totally put off by that. Actually.
Well, she was just confused. She's like, what are you crying about? She didn't understand at all.
And she was like, I guess it's because it's like part of their childhood or something. And like, yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is. She was really How confused. Do you not know this? Like, you do Casey and Finnegan. Like, yeah. That was kind of a funny moment. Now this is like this next one's really sad. So they were, I guess, like it was a wrap party. They had finished a season of filming, and Lynn, Ernie Coombs' wife, was to join the cast for this party, and she just never showed up. And it turns out that night she was hit by a car and killed. Mm-hmm. So a car drove up onto the sidewalk and hit her in front of a Loblaws. This was 1992, and she was killed, 55 years old. Yeah. And he was like, he was an extreme wife guy. Like, he loved his wife so much. And so he was he like the way the documentary tells it anyway, that he was totally devastated. But what do you think about this part of the documentary?
It was extremely sad.
It was pretty sad, wasn't it?
And then he just continued on with the show and like
Yeah.
making appearances on other shows. Like he didn't cancel anything because he's like,
No.
my wife wanted me to do this.
Yeah. So there's an interview with Fred Penner, who
Had him on as a guest. Like
he had his own
days.
show at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Mr. Dressup had been scheduled as a guest appearance where they were
Yeah.
going to sing a song together. And he came on anyway. And this was just 2 or 3 weeks after his wife had died. And the song they sang was, it goes like this: every day must pass away, never to come again. Together tomorrow, my friend, we'll be together tomorrow again.
It's so sad.
Yeah, and Fred Penner's like, that's the most emotional moment I've ever lived in performance on a stage, was with Mr. Dressup.
Singing that together.
Yeah.
I mean, like realizing while they're singing it that it was about.
Oh, he looks really, when they're showing Mr. Dressup, he looks pretty rough, actually.
Oh, yeah.
He looks pretty scared, actually.
Yeah.
You're like, he's going to cry. Is he going to cry? He looks like he might.
Yeah.
In that
Well,
when
I'm
he's singing.
surprised he didn't.
No, here's where the dark secrets of Mr. Dressup come out. He wasn't even a Canadian citizen.
That is a dark secret.
He had been in Canada.
How could he not be Canadian?
He'd been in Canada for 30 years, and he wasn't even a Canadian citizen. So he only took his Canadian citizenship in 1994. They show, I think they show. Okay, this is also maybe a skeleton in the closet. So Mr. Dressup's they show him performing at, I think maybe it's like,
I think it's the citizenship ceremony.
It is a citizenship ceremony where he's going to be getting his citizenship, I guess. And it's
Parliament Hill.
on Parliament Hill for Canada Day. It's like a Canada Day, that big party with like musicians on the big stage and everything. And so, and here comes Mr. Dressup busts out onto the stage. He's wearing a red, like Adidas style suit, like and it has a Canadian maple leaf on it. And he's got sunglasses on, and he has a baseball cap on backwards. And he's rapping. He's rapping. He's like, hey, Canada. Oh, Canada. Hey, Canada. Oh, Canada. He's like, my name is Mr. Dressup. You can call me Mr. D. I'll sing you a song about Canada from Newfoundland to BC.
Yeah.
And
it goes on for a while. You know what's in 1994, I was in high school, and like I often went to that Parliament Hill Canada Day thing.
Did you see him?
But no. Oh. I definitely didn't see him. I wish I could say that I did, but I feel like I would remember that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the era when Tom Green. Is this the same year? Is this around the same time that Tom Green would have his like comedy rap?
Oh yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, but that wasn't supposed to be comedy. He really wanted to be a rapper.
Oh. No, we have that whole show about it. It is it's a bit ambiguous, but it is clearly funny though too. But so this is 1994, they show. I mean, listen, let's be honest. If you were to watch all these old Mr. Dressups, there are 4,000 of them in existence somewhere. I'm sure a bunch of them are on YouTube. If you were to watch them, I'm sure you'd see stuff that is like, that's not such a great thing to say or do.
Well, the black puppet was operated by a white guy.
Oh, they talk about that. Yeah.
They talk about how like that would not be like, now we would know better.
Yeah. Of course. I mean, of course, it'd be all kinds of stuff like this. So they don't show. This is the only embarrassing thing they show Mr. Dressup doing.
Yeah,
really.
And it's
and it's not that embarrassing. It's lighthearted. So this is funny. So Jonathan Torrance, of course, he hosted the that kind of teen talk show in the 90s, early 2000s called Jonavision. So he mentions that the 2 highest rated episodes of his show were the Degrassi Reunion and Childhood Idols? Childhood Heroes.
They had the Pokeroo.
He had Pokeroo. They got the Pokeroo
Sharon, Lois, and Bram.
Sharon, Lois, and Bram. And he says, but even in that context, when Mr. Dressup comes out,
the crowd goes wild.
Tears the place down. The crowd goes wild.
And
the kids are like hooting and hollering.
Well, they're like teenagers. They're not. Yeah, they go crazy.
Yeah, they go crazy for Mr. Dressup.
And he's just kind of laughing humbly. But what was I gonna say? Jonathan Torrance. Oh, never mind. Oh, was Jonavision before or after Trailer Park Boys?
Oh, it's before.
It was before.
Yeah. Well, hold on, because Jonavision goes to 2001. And I think Trailer Park Boys is running in 1999. So there's a bit of crossover there. Yeah.
But he was on something else before Jonavision. Like he was already known, but I can't remember from what. Anyway, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, Jonavision would be an interesting episode of Sweater Weather.
Actually, it would be. Let's do Jonavision.
We should probably do Jonavision. So, okay, we're getting Mr. Dressup is, he's getting up there in years. He ends up retiring in, I guess it's 1996. That's when he retires, and he retires from the show, but he still continues to give live performances, touring. He still does that. He goes. Guess where he goes, guys? He goes back to Maine. He leaves Canada, the country that made him.
Just because he wants to hang out with his grandchildren.
He wants to hang out with his family. On this lake house in Maine. And they show him having like fun retirement stuff, like doing stuff on the beach and playing with his grandkids in antique cars. I guess he looks like he had some antique cars. I don't know if he's a Jay Leno exactly. Jay Leno having like hundreds of cars or something. I think he actually literally has dozens or hundreds of
that's horrifying.
I don't know if that I know. That's the difference between a Canadian and American celebrity. But in terms of how much money they make. But so there's it is a little bit sad. Mr. Dressup died like before his time probably. He was 73, not super old. But he had, so he got an infection from a minor surgery that was related to like a dental procedure. Yeah. And that it seems to have induced a stroke as he was trying to be treated for this infection. And this was happening, this is pretty complicated too. It was happening during 9/11. Like he had a stroke.
September 10th.
So like maybe the day before. Yeah. And he died on September 18th.
Okay.
And so 9/11 had just happened or was happening at the same time. So air travel was canceled everywhere, right? If you remember. And so his son who lived in England was trying to get back to Canada.
And his baby was born on September 10th.
Oh, and his baby was born at the same time.
Yeah.
That's what he said. That's right. So he was trying to travel back to the US to see his father as he was dying. But I guess he was traveling with a Canadian airline or something.
Yeah, Air Canada, he said.
Is that what he said? Right. So he was talking to the airline agent who couldn't find him a ticket, and he just told the airline agent that he was going to see his dad, Mr. Dressup. And the airline agent, of course, knew who Mr. Dressup was, and so got him a ticket right away.
Yeah.
No, that's not fair.
No, but whatever.
Oh, well, we're supposed to that's nice.
Well, it's not fair, but...
He probably needed the ticket more than the other person who didn't get the ticket because of that.
Their dad was also dying. It wasn't Mr. Dressup.
Well, that's his fault. He could have been Mr. Dressup, but he wasn't, was he? He was just a lawyer somewhere, or who knows what he did. Anyway, so at Mr. Dressup's funeral, Casey and Finnegan do a performance, and this is pretty sweet.
Oh my God. Well, first of all, the son is wearing Mr. Dressup's
wearing
costume.
that ant or spider costume. Yeah. He's wearing that at the podium.
Yeah.
Saying, I found this in my dad's closet.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cute. And then he tries to do a routine with Casey and Finnegan. Now, he's not very good.
He's not terrible.
But Casey and Finnegan, they kill it. They totally bring the house down here. So Casey's like, Finnegan wants to know, just like everybody wants to know where Mr. Dressup is because he's not here.
Yeah.
And then Finnegan speaks into Casey's ear.
Yeah.
And of course we don't hear. And then Casey says, well, Finnegan knows where Mr. Dressup is. He says he's in our hearts. Oh. You're like, oh my God, that is where Mr. Dressup is. And of course we get the message from the land of imagination.
Yeah.
Where Finnegan speaks.
Oh,
yeah, anyway. You're like, oh man. Anyway, did I care about Mr. Dressup before watching this documentary? Not really. But right now, is Mr. Dressup the nicest thing ever? Yep. Yeah. As far as I'm concerned, yep.
I mean, it's funny because I did care about Mr. Rogers, saw the documentary about him, continued to care about him, didn't care about Mr. Dressup. Now care about Mr. Dressup.
And now he's displaced. You're like, you know what? Mr. Rogers, kiss off.
No. I love both Mr. Rogers and Mr. Dressup.
Both Misters.
And I am disappointed that Mr. Dressup is not Canadian.
He did become
It was
Canadian.
not his fault.
He became Canadian in 1994.
Yeah. I mean, I only became Canadian in like 2010 or something. So.
All right. I mean, you really can't criticize Mr. Dressup.
No, I became Canadian in 2006.
I think my father became Canadian, in the 90s at some point, even though he'd been in Canada about as long as Mr. Dressup had. And it had to do with like legal reasons. He was afraid of. Anyway, I won't get into it.
I'd been in Canada since 1983, and I became Canadian in 2006.
Yeah, so you just didn't do the paperwork either, did you?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I was 7
when you came.
Yeah, so it took I wasn't really the kind of person that did paperwork for quite a time.
Yeah,
because I was child.
You're a child.
And then my childhood went by and I still wasn't a Canadian citizen, and then I was just used to not being one.
Right, but it does cause problems.
Oh yeah, because the reason I became one eventually was because I was going to leave Canada for too long. Like if you leave for more than 6 months, you lose your permanent resident status.
Yeah, that's not good for flexibility of lifestyle.
And then you're like, wait a minute, if I'm not Canadian, why am I?
I was raised in Canada.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you never did the paperwork now, did you?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's no good. And also you can't vote.
Can't vote.
Yeah, which is
saves you some time. Every 4 years or so.
I for one am glad Mr. Dressup became a Canadian citizen.
Yeah, I mean, obviously,
even if he humiliated himself at the citizenship ceremony
with that awesome rap.
The lowest point of his career.
My name is Mr. Dressup, and I'm here to say
I'm here to wear a costume in a special way.
I'm sure Casey and Finnegan, they would dress them up too, right? In little costumes.
I don't remember.
I think they would.
Probably.
Yeah.
Do you think they were Canadian citizens?
They weren't. They were Australian.
Oh, yeah.
Because Judith Lawrence was Australian.
That's right. Well,
anyway,
they could have been Canadian citizens from Australia. Anyway.
It does. Honestly, do we care about the citizenship of Mr. Dressup? We don't. Obviously, we don't care. But I think
it was a nice gesture because he had this huge influence on Canadians, you know?
Yeah.
And the sort of kind vibe, that's so Canadian, you know?
Well, obviously that goes to show that it isn't. It's nothing to do with Canadian at all.
I mean, Canadians are just as awful as anyone else.
Or nice, whatever.
Or nice, whatever.
Yeah. So that was the documentary, Mr. Dressup, The Magic of Make-Believe. Highly recommend if you're in to feel nostalgic feelings and think about how time passes and it is never to be found again, and how childhood is a magic time
that can continue into adulthood.
And that land of imagination. Well, that's actually Mr. Rogers' thing.
Yeah, but I mean, let's face it, they were both very much in the land of imagination.
The land of imagination is a nice place to hang out when you can.
Yeah.
Any closing thoughts, Naomi?
No, I mean, I'm just glad that I have puppets in my life, and I'm glad that I don't know if Mr. Dressup and Mr. Rogers had anything to do with that. I'd like to say thank you to them.
How about you, Paulus? Any closing thoughts?
Oh, well, thanks for asking.
You've been listening this whole time, so.
Yeah, I've just been sitting right next to Naomi here.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never seen Mr. Rogers.
Or Mr. Dressup?
I mean, the truth is,
or
I'm
Mr.
an adult.
Dressup?
No.
You're an adult?
Oh, Mr. Dressup,
you were born an adult.
Well, I've been an adult for a long time.
Yeah.
And I've never really been into TV. So, I mean, I'm a grown man, I actually...
You're too mature for that stuff.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
But at the same time, anyone who has a puppet is a friend of mine.
All right. I like that. Thanks, Paulus.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks, Naomi.
Thanks for having me on Sweater Weather. And I'd like to add that I'm made of sweaters.
You're basically a sweater yourself.
I'm actually made of sweaters.
You're made of sweater material.
So it's always sweater weather for Paul Swobody. Over and out.
Thanks, Paulus. Okay. And thank you, Naomi.
And thank you, Aaron.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the show. See you next
week.
Bye. Doon to doon to doon to doon to doon to doon to doon.